greatest cultural periods in American history was during the time between World War I and the mid-1930s. The Harlem Renaissance was a period where black writers, poets, artists, and musicians and photographers thrived in the small area called Harlem. The Harlem Renaissance was a period where black Americans' culture flourished and became a significant part of the American identity. The push that drove many black Americans north was mainly due to the bleak living the South provided. In 1910, 89% of all black Americans lived in the South, and most lived in rural areas. Between 1913 and 1915, sharecroppers fell into deep debt or lost about everything due to devastation of the cotton crops and floods. Also, the South still had Jim Crow laws, a large population of hate groups, and frequent hate crimes. Black farmers had a dim future, and the majority of the people sought for a better life. The industrial North showed a lot of promise with its cheap factory labor. Between 1919 and 1926, many black Americans moved from the South to the booming industrial urban areas, like Chicago, Washington, D.C., and especially New York. This was known as the Great Migration. Between 1920 and 1930, over 750,000 black Americans moved from the oppressing South to the urban areas in the North. The Harlem area in Manhattan alone attracted over 175,000 blacks. It was the most concentrated area of black Americans. With a large population of black Americans moving north, and a large presence of lower-class white immigrants already in cities like New York and Boston, the black Americans were not taken in with open arms. As a result, most people coming from the South were pushed to live in the run-down areas of the cities, places like Harlem. The past history for many of the black Americans who moved north didn't hinder them. Many people found they had similar experiences, and instead of hanging on to their unpleasant history, these people celebrated their culture with pride. The Harlem Renaissance actually began when black Americans made their first artistic and literary achievement. It began around when James Weldon Johnson's novel, Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man, was published in 1912. A few years later, there was another step forward in 1917 when the first desegregated magazine, Seven Arts, published 3 poems by Claude McKay. In that year, the first black American magazine, The Messenger, co-founded by Chandler Owen and A. Philip Randolph, was published. Also in 1917, for the first time, there were 3 plays with black cast members on Broadway. This was the beginning for independence for black American art and literature. In 1920, another Claude McKay poem called Spring in New Hampshire was published. Claude McKay was a well-known Jamaican-American poet and writer who was a key figure during the Harlem Renaissance. He's more famously known for his novel, Home to Harlem, that was published in 1928. However, Claude is not the most recognized poet of the Harlem Renaissance.
I built my hut near the Congo, and it lulled me to sleep. I looked upon the Nile and raised the pyramids above it. I heard the singing of the Mississippi when Abe Lincoln went down to New Orleans, and I've seen its muddy bosom turn all golden in the sunset.
This is Langston Hughes reading his poem, The Negro Speaks of Rivers, which he wrote when he was 19, right after he graduated high school. Hughes was an accomplished writer of fiction and drama, but better known for his poetry. He published 2 other famous works later in the 1920s, The Weary Blues in 1926, and Fine Clothes to Jews in 1927. There were many other significant poets from this time period. Countine Cullen, who had some famous works in the late 1920s, Jean Toomer, who published his famous novel Cain in 1923, and there were many other writers who became popular in the later years of the Renaissance. Although writing and poetry were a significant part of the Harlem Renaissance, music was also an important aspect of this time. Duke Ellington is considered to be one of America's greatest composers, recording artists, and band leader. He formed his band The Washingtons in 1923 and formed his own orchestra in 1927. Also that year, his orchestra started playing at the famous Cotton Club, a joint run by mobsters in Harlem that allowed only white audiences. By 1930, Duke and his band were broadcasted around the U.S., and they started touring around America and Europe in the 1940s. Duke is one of many significant artists from this time. Singing St. Louis blues is Bessie Smith, the most recognizable blues singer in the 1920s. She worked with other famous musicians, such as Louis Armstrong, who can be heard playing the cornet. Louis Armstrong is another very well-known musician who became increasingly popular in the 1920s. In 1929, he made his first appearance in Broadway with his performance, Ain't Misbehavin'. Other great artists from this time include Jelly Roll Morton, U.B. Blake, Fletcher Henderson, and many more. The music during the Harlem Renaissance inspired much of the art and dances of this time, like the Lindy Hop dance. Dancers were attracted to the Savoy, a place where whites and blacks could be found dancing together. During the Harlem Renaissance, many whites would travel to Harlem for entertainment. The hot spots that attracted both white and black Americans included the Savoy, the Cotton Club, and the Apollo Theater. Harlem was the heart and soul for black American culture. If anyone wanted to be a dancer, singer, artist of any form, they would come to Harlem at some point in time. Harlem was a crazy place to live in the 1920s, as clubs and joints were crowded from early afternoon to early morning the next day. However, around the time of the stock market crash in 1929 and the Great Depression starting soon after, the prosperity and the energy in the city quickly died down. The Harlem Renaissance was a movement for the new black American culture, as well as a celebration of their African American identity. It has left a huge print on the American identity, as art, music, and literature from that time are still looked at today.